wanted to see what would grow and what wouldn't grow. We're at about 2,900 feet. It was actually a greater revelation.
Somehow I think our Father has a purpose in all of this. One of his purposes is to keep us in the Word.
But what we're trying to show people is that they can actually do this. And I know they can because we're doing it.
Ammunition and gun sales are on the rise in America and Canada, with rumors of a civil war coming. And others think what's coming is the entire collapse of America. There are also people thinking that this is the end of the world in its entirety and the second coming of Christ. With me, Tom Stapleton again, and the million-dollar question for you, Tom, right now would be, is this the end of the world, and how do you know? You've probably been asked before. How do you know this is the end of the world? This is something that my grandfather used to say. His grandfather said before that. We were always at the end of the world. How do you know it's right now?
Yeah, well, I've had it said they've been talking about the end of the world for hundreds of years. Well, actually for 6,000 years, ever since Adam and Eve were given the promise that the Messiah would come and restore all things. They've been talking about that event for many, many thousands of years. So it's very interesting. We come to the place where we feel we're at the end. And people ask me the question, well, how do you know you're at the end? Just the same thing that you've just said. And because there's a cost to being at the end. If I'm going to go to Hawaii, I'm going to prepare to go to Hawaii. I'm going to take my bathing suit maybe and, some beach stuff and whatever. And so I'm preparing for an event, a place that I'm going. And so in the time of the end, when Yeshua actually returns, he's not coming to inhabit the beautiful homes that we've developed here. The idea being is there's a time when we're going to have to shed everything that we have and put it into either our survival or into the work of the gospel, sharing the gospel, and so on. There's just so many things. He's not coming to collect the deeds of our houses. That's not the point. And so people say, well, how do you know? Because exactly as you said, and my grandfather, whatever, not my grandfather, but other people would say, my grandfather thought it was the end of the world and he never saved for his retirement and so on. Well, if we actually have a loving God, which is a given, obviously, is he not going to make that known to us? Is he not going to help us to understand when we're there? And we don't have to look too far. The red letters in the Bible help us a lot. Yeshua said, when you see these things. So, what things? Well, when his disciples were talking to him, they said, what is the sign of your coming in the end of the age? In Matthew 24, they asked him the question. And then he gave them a whole series of events. And then he rounded it up and he said, when you see these things, know that the end is near. He didn't say, think that the end is near. He says, no. So evidently, according to Yeshua, we can know when we've arrived at the time of the end. Well, how do you do that? Well, it's really quite simple. The prophecies that Yeshua had in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. How can I say that? Well, it's really quite simple. His disciples asked him, what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age, the time of his second coming and his kingdom? So if we go to those prophecies and we can see the events out there, because that's what he was talking about, world events out there, if we can line those up with the prophecies, that's how we can know that we're there. But you see, the problem that people have is there's so many voices out there. And so how do they know which voice to listen to? Well, that's a lot of confusion, a lot of voices, a lot of different stories. But evidently we can know that too, because he said when the Spirit of Truth, and we covered this a little bit earlier in the other meeting, when the Spirit of Truth comes, he's going to lead us and guide us into all truth. And people leave off the rest of what he said. He said, and he will show you things to come. That's prophecy. So the Holy Spirit, who inspired the prophets of what's coming is going to inspire us with an understanding of what the prophets wrote. And so if we're not studying the prophets, then we don't know. And we will never know. And so we will be left, in the cities. And, I make reference to Babylon and Persia and the Jews that never left and went back to Jerusalem. They had a death decree. These are all like little pictures, little sandbox pictures, if you will. This is going to happen on a world scale. So if people don't believe, then they will stay where they are until it's too late. And this is what we're trying to get across to people. You don't want to stay in Babylon. We read lots of prophecies. Get up, flee, Jeremiah 51. Flee from the midst of Babylon. And of course, that was back then. That was the admonition that the prophet was giving them back then. But we here at the end of time, we look at the book of Revelation and it says that there's this mystery Babylon, the Great. That's what the type was in the Old Testament. We've got Babylon the Great that's going to rule the whole world at the end of time. So that admonition to flee from Babylon is more important now than it's ever been. And Babylon is the downtowns of the world. That's where Babylon reigns, in the cities. And that's where it always has. And people say, well, what's God got against cities? Well, you want to check out the first city and the second city and the third city. It was all evil men that created these cities. God doesn't live in concrete jungles. And so you don't really get in touch with the God of nature until you move into his area of expertise. And concrete jungles are not where he reigns. Actually, the prince of this world reigns in those concrete jungles. So what I'm trying to tell people is if we can know what the prophecies say, and we can understand them, and we can make sense out of the prophecies with what's going on in the world today, then I believe we can know that the end is near. Now, 4 years ago, I've been telling people this for longer than I can remember. And now 30 years I've been telling people, look, we're heading towards this time. Well, 4 years ago, I decided it was time to get out of the city. And that's why we're where we are. And now I talk to people and they are scrambling. These are the same people I was talking to 5 years ago, 6 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. But I just, and I don't want to judge people, but I just have to take it down to belief. Belief causes us to move in a direction. So people say, well, the devils believe. Yeah, the devils believe, but if you actually believe and you trust God, it's going to cause you to move in a certain direction. And as I've said before, some people believe that, oh, well, I'll just stay in the city, and if I get martyred, so what? That's the way it's going to be. Well, unless they've been, convinced and convicted that they have to stay in the city because God has a special mission for them in the city, I would say it's a lack of faith to just say, well, if I stay in the city and I get martyred, that's not reason. That is a lack of faith. You need to know the direction that God wants you to go. If it's in the city, then so be it. He called me out of the city, and I had to follow that conviction. I had no choice but to follow that conviction. So what I'm telling, as people, are getting these convictions, it's getting dangerous out there. I mean, the COVID thing, and you even mentioned something about COVID on the internet, and you're off. They'll cancel your account and everything, and the elections and all of this stuff. You're just out. You're on the outside. So we can see definitely we are moving into a place where you will not have free speech. Well, that all lines up with the prophetic events, the one world order, and so on. So I am 100% convinced that we are there. We are knocking on the door. In fact, the door is just starting to crack open of this time that the prophets have talked about for thousands of years. So I think it's chapter 1 Corinthians 14, says that prophecy is for believers. You see, prophecy doesn't do you any good unless you believe. And so when people say, well, how do you know, you got the prophecy right? You know what? Ask the Holy Spirit, because he's the one that inspired them. He's the one. I can't convince anyone that the prophecies are right, the way I'm looking at it. It has to be the Spirit of God. And that's why Yeshua said, pray. Don't pray to me, or don't pray to you, or don't pray to anyone else. What I mean is, don't ask anyone else what they think, and leave it at that. Talk to people, get their ideas, and then pray, God, Holy Spirit, is this the truth? Because the Spirit is the revealer of all truth.
What is the idea on the minds of people that you meet that aren't studying the Bible? I know you work in a college, you do electrical work, you're a public person in a sense. You're not just hidden away somewhere, or like people like to straw man a Bible working, preaching type guy like yourself as being disconnected. But you're not disconnected. You know a lot of people. What is your general consensus on what people are thinking is coming next?
Well, the spectrum is wide on that. There's every end of it. But I find most people here in North America have had some kind of religious background teaching. Like an example, basic. If you say the name Jesus, they know who you're talking about. It's no secret. So they have had some kind of Bible teaching for the most part. So I was talking to one of my coworkers one day, and I was unpacking some of these prophecies. And he doesn't claim to be a believer, but he was raised a Roman Catholic. So in the back of his mind, just like mine when I was raised a Roman Catholic, is I thought the Bible was important. It just wasn't important for me. And so I neglected it. But in the mind, it's like God says that every man that comes into the world, he gives light to. And of course, the light develops if you grow in that. But I had this seed of belief, although it was very small. And so I sensed this in this other person. So we're talking, we get into some of these prophecies, what's going to happen. And I told him that this war that's coming with Islam in the West, and we got into that. And it was like a couple days later, they had this big France terrorist attack that killed a bunch of people and so on. He comes in the next day, and I come in just behind him, like 5 minutes behind him, and he's in the lunchroom telling all the rest of the instructors. He said, Tom said this was going to happen. He was just going nuts with all these guys. And then I came in and walked down the hallway. I didn't know what was going on. And he came out of there and chased me. He says, what's going to happen next? It's just like, and I'm just going, wow, like, I'm just reading the Word. And the Word is going to stand. And I don't know the events from day to day. What God has shown us is the big picture. So when there's a terrorist attack in France, I'm not surprised, because that's all going to happen. I didn't know what day it was. That's not what's revealed in the Word. What's revealed in the Word is the pace is going to pick up. And the rumors of the wars is going to pick up. It doesn't give the details, but it does give the details of the war. And it's the West, led by the United States, and it's going to be against Islam. And we can see that clash coming. Anyone that wants to open their eyes, it's not a secret. It's in the news every day. There's something going on in the Middle East every day that you can tell the temperature is just going up.
It's amazing to me how the divide in America has caused people not to see that global struggle coming, but just to look at their own brother as their enemy, their own neighbors as their enemy.
Right, and that's what the enemy does. You don't have to look too far. Everyone that's listening to this has probably been part of a church at some point, or some kind of group. Well, these things always divide. So what the enemy does is he gets people to divide, and now they can't fight together. They're fighting each other. And so, it's the way the story goes from beginning to end is Satan gets in there, or someone that wants power gets in there, which is obviously led by the enemy. And they start causing these divides so that people can't work together. And that's, I believe, my personal opinion is the New World Order, in order for it to be set up, the United States has to be taken out. Because the United States, and Great Britain also, because Great Britain and the United States have one thing very much in common, and that's the beginnings of their being, so to speak, was on Judeo-Christian values. And they're really the last stronghold, if you will. And I know a lot of people say, oh, no, they've lost. No, there are conservatives in both of those countries. And that's why the United States has this great divide, because we've got a set of people, and most of them are very wealthy and rich and powerful, and they control the medias and so on. They are going towards the New World Order, which will lead to a one world order. But the conservatives, they don't want any part of it. And so what they're fighting is they're fighting this movement toward one world order because they want to be sovereign. They want to guard the borders. Don't let all these people in, because it's going to totally change America, which it will. Which it will, because these people are not coming in to be Americans. And the bad guys, if you will, the terrorist cells and so on, they're not coming in to be part of our society. They're coming in to destroy America. That's just a fact. And that's what radical Islam, and I say radical Islam is a Islamic person that takes their religion seriously. Just like a conservative Christian, they take their religion seriously. And they go out, Christians go out, and they evangelize. That's people that take their religion serious. That's the mandate they got from their master. Well, the mandate that Islam got from their master is take over the world. And you can do it any way you want. You can overpopulate the world, you can do it by war, and so on.
I remember about 10 years ago when Christopher Hitchens was still alive, and there were other political analysts and authors that would say that on the news, that any Islamic that's taking their religion seriously is anti-America, death to Americans. But that voice is gone.
Yes.
They don't bring that onto the news anymore. There's still lots of people that are aware of that,
right,
but they don't talk about it on the news anymore.
No, they don't. And it's not politically correct, because that's prejudice and white supremacy and all this kind of stuff. It's garbage, actually. And what it is to move us toward a direction where we have one government in the world. And we can see that. I mean, anyone, again, that's looking can see that. The UN has locked down through the World Health Organization, which is a subsidiary or part of the UN. It's a UN delegation, and they're to look after world health. They basically has shut the whole world down. So we have just seen the power of the UN. And that's where this is going. It's all power and all authority. They will shut down every country, and if you don't fall in line with their way of thinking, you will be taken out.
So this isn't news to anybody. Everybody is aware of this. So we don't want to get too much into that. Let's shift
Some
back to...
people actually aren't.
I don't know one person who's not aware of this.
Oh, okay. I know quite a few. But your point is good. Most people that are watching this are aware of what's going on. I want to say again, they're aware of what's going on, but their confusion is it might get better, or it might be prolonged. See, they don't understand, and I just can't overemphasize this, is they don't understand that the prophecies are about to be played out for the time of the end. There is no time to waste. If somebody's getting a conviction that we're at the end, they need to act on that. If they don't act on that, they will lose the conviction and they will lose sight of that. We can't lose sight of that. And I heard it said one time, the disciples, as we look in the book of Acts and so on, and even in the Gospels, the disciples were convinced that Yeshua could come back in their lifetime. And so if we're one of their followers, And of course, they were following Yeshua. We're not a follower of John, so to speak, but they followed Yeshua, I believe. And so if we're following their writings, then we have to believe the same thing. Otherwise, we're not one of them. That's the way the script goes. And so in my study of these prophecies, people cannot put this off any longer. It's late. It's late in time.
So just looking back at the intro that I gave, I mentioned the Civil War. That's just one struggle. If that does happen, the problem's not solved on the other end of it.
Oh, no.
If America collapses, for example, I mean, that doesn't correct the world and let us go back to any kind of normal world either.
Right.
So let's talk about the scenario that you're teaching. Going back, thinking about the intro that I gave, I mentioned two struggles, like the wars of rumors and wars, right? The Civil War in America, people are talking about that could happen. Americans shooting at each other. Or this is the collapse of an empire. The great American empire, just as ones previously, is showing signs that it is over. It can't repair itself. But, even if those were to occur, the whole world isn't put back together where we can just continue on, is it? I mean, let's look at the end of the world scenario again that you teach that's in the Bible. So if we go back to what you teach that's unique, that's what you bring, what you offer to the table, and what you are so convinced of that you want to share with the believing world. Can you take us back to when you put together in your own personal Bible studies that the dates and times given in prophecies fits together with the timing that's given by God long before in his yearly sanctuary system, where you have a spring festival, summer festival, fall festival, that those dates are actually a timeline that the end time prophecies will fit into?
Okay. Wow, that's pretty loaded. Where do I want to start? I want to start right where you were just speaking there. We're going to go back just a little bit. You talked about wars and rumors of wars. So we really need to set a stage for this. Where did I begin this? I started studying prophecy in 1983. That's too far back for me to remember. But I really got serious all through those years, and it's been a real passion of mine to figure it out. And people say, oh, that's all you want to know is prophecy. Well, the whole Bible is a book of prophecy. The whole thing, right from Genesis through to Revelation, it's God's promises and what he's going to do for his people and stuff. And that's really what I've been studying. And so an unfolding the events at the end is contained in the prophecies. Where is it contained? We get a glimpse, and I say this. I say this because it's really quite serious. The best teacher the world has ever seen has been Yeshua. Absolutely the best teacher, bar none. And so that's really where we should go. He was asked a direct question. What is the sign of your coming in the end of the age? In Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21, that little narrative is recorded there. And so he starts it off with do not be deceived. And then he goes on to say wars and rumors of wars. But in Luke, he adds a dimension. He says commotions. And commotions actually isn't really the same thing as war. It's more like civil unrest. It's more unrest within countries. And you see, this is the starting point. Wars, rumors of wars, commotions. So I was down in the States not too long ago. I got a real cool story about getting across the border and so on. It was just wild. Anyone that has to go across borders now, it's getting really tough. COVID, all the rest of it. And so on. So we had quite an experience getting across the border, but forget about that for now. So we're down there, Gina and I are down there, cleaning up some business down there, and we got to speak to a lot of people when we were there. I have a purpose generally. I want to know what's on people's minds. So I would get them into a conversation about what's going on in the States and so on. And every time I got them to this question, what do you think's going to happen in the United States? The answer 100% came back, a civil war. So whether it happens or not, it actually fits in line with the prophecies, because the prophecies are very clear that the United States is going to be taken out, because the world is tired of them to be the superpower. So they have to be taken out. So somewhere in the prophecies, we should be able to see that, because it's the greatest nation. If we've actually arrived, and in the prophecies it says kingdoms and kings and so on, so we should be able to find them. We can't find them. We're not going to get into that right now, but the United States has to be taken out. If Biden, and I'm not going to call him President Biden for a specific reason, if Biden stays in power and those around him stay in power, the United States is going to be taken out sooner than later. But if the Republicans get back in, who want their own sovereignty, they want to lock up the borders, protect the country, and remain the superpower in the world, things are going to be quite a bit different. And this is the way I believe it has to happen. In the prophecies, we have to see a conservative government in the United States, because there's some things that have to happen that only a conservative government would be able to do. So this is where we're going. So when we look in the prophecies, we can see all these things happening. And maybe next time we'll talk about that, we'll lay this out. But you asked, how do the prophetic times fit into the prophecies? So I think I want to use the board for this one, because I think it'll make a little more sense. Can we do that?
So I just wanted to reiterate, but this is very simple. This is a year of the sanctuary service that the Jewish people had. The biblical festivals, which start with Passover in the spring, in the summer there's the Pentecost, and in the fall there's the Tabernacles, and there's a few other elements of that Tom will show us. If you take that yearly schedule and you look at the prophecies of the future for the second coming that were given to Daniel, in those prophecies there are numbered days, like the length of time that some events should happen. So everybody that studies prophecy knows those numbered days, and everybody who studies the Old Testament knows that there's a yearly festival calendar. But what happens when you take the festival calendar and you overlay it with those numbered days of prophecies? You actually get numbered days that line up, and the days line up with events that are the same, that are actually, in meaning, the same events. So the Jewish people missed this. The Christian church missed this. This is almost entirely unique to Tom's teaching. However, there could be other people out there teaching this. Is this the way that you would say that?
Well, there's a lot of people trying to come to grips together because they understand that these prophetic signposts here, I've got trumpets, Day of Atonement, I've just abbreviated that D of A, the Feast of Tabernacles, then you have in the spring the Passover, Feast of Unleavened Bread, F of U, and the Feast of First Fruits. So these are the things that people are working with now, that they're trying to figure out, okay, well, God works on this timetable. This is kind of an awakening right now. People are seeing that. Why are they seeing that? Well, when you go back to the first coming of Yeshua, they see that he was on a timetable. And so they see that he died right on Passover Day, that he was resurrected on the right day, on the Feast of First Fruits, and he poured out his Spirit, which I don't have here at this point, but he poured out his Spirit on the day of Pentecost, which is significant. So people see how God has worked in the past, and that's how we know he's going to work in the future, because he always does the same thing over and over again. The problem with we forget what he does, and so we're not looking at his track record. His track record says that the whole plan of salvation is built around this calendar that he gave to his people for the purpose of a prophetic message. And so if the festivals are a prophetic message, then we should be able to even put them into the prophecies, because the prophecies are a delineation of the events that are going to transpire at the end of time. So we should be able to overlay them, and that's what we're going to do, and we're going to use that with the numbers that are given to us in these prophecies. And of course, we don't have time to go through each individual one. We've got some videos that have that already. And we're going to be working on more because there's always more information that we're getting, more data that we're collecting that's making it so obvious what's going on. Yeah. So there we have it. So I've put up here the Feast of Trumpets, Day of Atonement, Tabernacles. These are fall festivals now. These are in the fall, which really were all about the fall harvest. That's the grapes, the olives, oil, and so on. And then the Passover in the spring, which was surrounded by the barley harvest. That was the first harvest in the spring. And the Feast of Unleavened Bread and the Feast of First Fruits. And the Feast of First Fruits offering was when that's what started the barley harvest. So they harvest that, and then they started harvesting the barley because it was ready, and it was all timed around the barley harvest and around the spring equinox, the new moon, and so on. Won't get into that now, but that's what time of year it was. And then what follows this, of course, in 7 weeks was the called the Feast of First Fruits as well, but that's Pentecost, what most people refer that to. Shavuot, if you're on the Hebrew side of things, that's what they would call Pentecost, is Shavuot. Yeah, so there's our timeline of events. Now, very interesting here in the prophecies, we can go back to Egypt, which is a type. What happened, I'll just ask you a question here, what happened at the end of the Egyptian experience for the Jews?
They left Egypt with a Passover.
Right, they left Egypt at the Passover. And what was that event? That was the deliverance from bondage, really. So when we think of it in that terms of the deliverance of bondage, what are we waiting for? Aren't we waiting for the same thing? We're waiting for a deliverance, right? So when I was raised Roman Catholic, I didn't get into too much theology. But now what I know about Roman Catholics is they take the position that all of these festivals were done away with when Jesus died or Yeshua died on the cross. And so they don't really look at these. But there is an awakening in Christianity to start looking at these because they see that they may be tied up in the second coming of Yeshua. So that's from a Catholic perspective. And I don't know what perspective.
I come from a Baptist
You
background.
come from a Baptist perspective. And basically they view the same thing. All these feasts were done away with at the cross. However, same thing again. There are some Baptists and some Presbyterians and Pentecostals and so on. They're actually starting to look more closely at the festivals, which is very, very interesting.
Right, but the first thing that I'm looking for is I want to see the timelines that they line up vertically. If you had the Daniel prophecy below this one, I want to see how these all fit together.
Okay, so that's good. So each one of these festivals represents a bigger picture in God's plan. And what we just looked at was the Passover would be deliverance of his people. So these are what they actually mean, something bigger. So we can look at that. Now, in Christianity, what happened was they did away with all of these, so they lost sight how they connected them to prophecy. In the Messianic movement, what they say is all of these were fulfilled at the first coming. And so all we have left to use for the second coming are just these 3 fall festivals. I propose that's incorrect. That's a false premise that they've used here. These were not, and I emphasize not with capital letters, fulfilled, filled full of meaning at his first coming. And the words of Yeshua tell us that very plainly. In Luke 22, verse 15 through 17, he said, I have longed to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. I will no longer eat of it, the Passover, until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God. Now I have to ask you a question. Are you in the kingdom of God yet?
No.
No, we're not. So is the Passover fulfilled yet?
No.
No. And this is what people don't understand. They're cyclical. They come and they go. They're on a clock, so to speak. Now we can go back in history, in biblical history, and it looks like Noah's deliverance from this world into his ark happened at the second Passover, which would have meant the first Passover came and went. That's very interesting. We can't overlook that. Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot had to feed the angels that came a feast of unleavened bread. Very interesting. A feast of unleavened bread. When does that happen? So Sodom was destroyed, it looks like, at a Passover, which is very, very meaningful for us at the time of the end. And so we can go, and of course the deliverance of the Israelites from Egypt happened at a Passover. But the whole system then started at Trumpets, and it went through to the Passover. The plagues all happened during this time period. And so this is what we're looking at. So let's look at what you're talking about. We see, I'm just going to give some references so people can look at this. In Daniel chapter 8, there's a reference to a festival. It's called the sanctuary being cleansed. It says that right in the prophecy, that the sanctuary will be cleansed. So couched in that prophecy, it tells us something. The sanctuary was cleansed on the feast of the Day of Atonement. So that's when the sanctuary was cleansed. We go back one more chapter, we see a judgment scene. Well, judgment begins at trumpets. So we see these overlays in the prophecies. Well, in this prophecy, we see a 1260-day period. In this prophecy that it mentions the Day of Atonement, we see a 2300 evening and morning time period as well.
Now, I'm a visual guy, and I'm a simpleton.
Okay.
Would you mind
Yes.
illustrating that so I can look at it as you're talking?
We're going to drop these down. So we're going to do another timeline here, and we're going to try and make some sense out of this. Okay. So we see here in the book of Daniel, we see a starting point here. And I'm just going to write the word daily. Now, the word daily comes from the book of Daniel. Actually, the starting point is from Numbers, and it's an appointed time that God gave his people. So the time periods in these prophecies, 1260, the 2300 and 1290, they're all based on the daily. It's the go point. Okay, so that's what we find in these prophecies in Daniel 8. It says, from the time the daily is taken away.
Okay, so you're not talking about how the sanctuary functions throughout the year. You're talking about in the prophecies, future prophecies.
Yes.
This whole plan of how the destruction happens, it begins with a moment of time where we start counting.
An event.
An event we're looking for to happen.
An event we're looking for that's called
and you're calling it daily.
It's called the taking away of the daily.
Okay.
It says, and I'll quote this, Daniel 12, I believe it's verse 11. It says, verbatim, from the time the daily is taken away and the abomination of desolation set up, there should be 1290 days.
Okay, so you're showing us where on this timeline?
Right. Okay, so from the time the daily's taken away and the abomination of desolation is set up. Okay? And that it's a bookend thing. From the time the daily's taken away and the abomination of desolation set up. That's how it's written. It says that it will be, maybe I'll just put it down right here, 1290 days. Okay? There's another prophecy in Daniel chapter 7. It says that this little horn power that changes times and laws, speaking of these times and laws, we will be put on a system in this world where this will all be done away with. It will actually be outlawed, and there will be a new system brought in, a new worship system that will have different times. So that power has a time period that says 1260 days or 3.5 years. Okay? So 12, 60 days, or 3.5 years. So now this is a time period that goes through here. So we're dealing with about a 3.5 year period. So when we're looking at these festival times, there, if we want to look at the last year, they will go and fall into the last year period. And that's how we know, that's how we can know today at what point Yeshua comes, which is very interesting. And people say, well, you don't know the day and the hour. I don't know the day and the hour that he's going to come. Not today. But I will at some point know the day and the hour. You're familiar with the text that I'm quoting from. Won't get into that text, but that text is very easily explained in a way that at some point we can know the day and the hour.
I'm also familiar with the text that Paul wrote. He said that for many people it will come unaware like a thief in the night. Then a moment later he says, but we are not children of the light, of the darkness,
right,
but children of the light.
Right, exactly.
So we'll see this coming.
And light is truth.
Yeah.
Yeah. So another verse says that it's not for you. Yeshua said before he left to his disciples, they wanted to know when he would set up this kingdom. He said it's not for you to know the times or the seasons, a direct reference to these time periods. It's not for you to know which ones they are. Really, that's what he's saying, or when it's going to happen. So, but I propose that it will be a time for us to know when the time comes.
Yeah, he said nothing is hidden that won't be revealed.
There you go, yeah. Okay, so we have one more time period that it talks about in in this sequence. We have a 1335-day period. So here again, as we mentioned the other day, is that God has told us how long this time of trouble is going to be. And that's really good news. We know how long we're going to have to endure. So now when we go back to another one, the Day of Atonement in the book of Daniel, it tells us 2,300 evenings and mornings, and then the sanctuary would be cleansed. So we know from the time the daily's taken away to 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary would be cleansed. So the sanctuary is cleansed on the Day of Atonement. That's when the complete sins are taken out of the temple, placed on the scapegoat, and so on. So that's when that happens. So that's at 2,300 evenings and mornings. It's been confused that it's been 2,300 days. They say that in the Bible text itself, it says days. But it shouldn't say days. It actually says evenings and mornings, and it's in reference to sanctuary. It's not in reference to a 24-hour period. It's in reference to sanctuary. Anytime you reference the morning and the evening as far as sanctuary is concerned, we're talking about morning and evening sacrifices. So if we have 2,300 evening and morning sacrifices, we actually have 1,150 days. And there's a lot of Bible scholars that are coming to grips with that reality. It's been said to be one or the other, but it seems like when you put this together on a timeline, 1,150 is the only thing that actually works. It makes more sense than anything else. So we're just going to use this is from Daniel 8. We have 1,150. Okay, so I'm working with these things, and I'm looking at them and studying them, and I have this timeline laid out. This again taken from Daniel 8. This one's taken from Daniel 7 and Daniel 11, or 12, sorry. And this one is also taken from Daniel 12 and also from Daniel 12. We see this time period 2 times in the book of Daniel, but 5 times in the book of Revelation. So it's 7 times in total, and these prophecies mingle together from Daniel and Revelation. So now, if we look in the prophecy of Daniel, we can see that there's a judgment in Daniel chapter 7. It's interesting that the Jews, from the beginning of the Feast of Trumpets to the Day of Atonement, they had a greeting that they made with each other. And it says, they would say, may your name be written in the book of life. Not the Lamb's book of life, but the book of life. And we see the Lamb's book of life in Revelation when the Lamb actually came and so on. So we see that this is a judgment. These are judgment festivals in the fall. So there was a 10-day period that they called the Days of Awe, and it was a time of repentance and so on. And then the Day of Atonement, the sanctuary was cleansed. All the sins that had been confessed were put onto the scapegoat, and now Israel started basically with a clean slate. So we say, okay, well, is there a judgment at the end of the world? Because all these things point to a greater event. It's just like the Passover lamb that they sacrificed every year. It was actually pointing to a greater event when the Lamb of God would be sacrificed on that appropriate time. So here we see the sanctuary would be cleansed at 1150, but if we back up just a little bit, we would have the Feast of Trumpets there. So there would be a 10-day period of judgment, which we see in Daniel chapter 11. So we can see that in Daniel chapter 11, and that's the neat things with the prophecies, when we see these events, when we connect the calendar, the festival calendar, and we know what time of year that's going to happen. We're going to know exactly when it's going to happen. So now it says at another time period, and this one is in Daniel chapter 7, it tells us that this power, this little horn power, is going to have its power for 1260 days. And then it's destroyed. So these are events that are going to transpire, and we're going to know exactly where we are on the timetable when this power is destroyed. And that we can see that in Revelation chapter 17 as well. It's a power that will rule the world called Babylon the Great. It will be destroyed at this point. Okay? So this is going to be after the judgment, which makes sense because after the judgment there will be the punishment meted out. But the punishment, generally speaking, even in earthly courts, isn't carried out immediately. It's this sentence, this death sentence is going to be, some people wait on death row for years and years. So this is what's going to happen here. And then at 1290, it says that the abomination of desolation is set up. I'm not going to get into what these events are meaning, but we will get into that later. So now at day 1335, Daniel is told, and this is in Daniel chapter 12, he says, you will rise to your inheritance at the end of days. This is the very last day that he saw. So here we can look at this. If he rises to his inheritance, at what festival do we have a resurrection? At what festival do we have resurrection?
When Jesus rose from the grave,
right, when
there were others that rose from the grave as well.
Exactly. So we have others rising from the grave. So we see in the typology of the festivals, we have a resurrection in the spring. We have resurrection in the spring, and we have deliverance in the spring. So these are things that are wrapped up in the festival calendar. So that's why I say we can't throw these away, which most people do, and they only focus on these. So let's say Daniel rises to his inheritance at the end of days. That's the last day we have in the prophecy. So I'm thinking, one night I was laying awake in bed, scratching my head on this, and I had an overwhelming conviction. It's just get up and put this all on paper. So I got up, I put all this basically like this, and I said, okay, if this is the Day of Atonement, because that's the language, if this is the Day of Atonement, and we have a resurrection at day 1335, I thought, how many days would there be if I went from the Day of Atonement and I started counting, because the Day of Atonement is on the 7th month of the 10th day. So if I went the 7th month of the 10th day and I counted all the way to first fruits, how many days would that be? So I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, okay, 1335 and I have 1150. Well, when I do the count, because of the festival calendar, the Day of Atonement, from the Day of Atonement to day 1335, when I just do the math and subtract these, I get 185 days. And so if I count from the Day of Atonement to the Day of First Fruits, I also get the exact same time period. Is that making any sense to you? And that's just randomly putting this together. This is not going and starting with, okay, it's that many days, I need to put that, so I need to write 1150. No, these amounts of time are given. It just so happens the terminology around 1150 is the cleansing of the sanctuary, which has to be the Day of Atonement. This is Resurrection Day at 1335. The Resurrection Day has to be this. Well, when I do the math from the Day of Atonement to this, it's exactly the same time period between the numbered days in the prophecies. So this is how I can know that the whole festival cycle is in play, because we see that in the time of the end. Now, it's very interesting if I go back to Egypt and I look at that deliverance, how it perfectly parallels the book of Revelation. We see 7 last plagues in the book of Revelation. We also, when we go back to the Egyptian bondage and the plagues when they came out, we see 3 plagues coming on all the people, the Israelites as well. But the 7 last plagues of the 10 were poured out only on the Egyptians.
So you're looking back to what has happened in the past.
Yes.
To know the latter end of
right.
things.
When we look at the past, we know what's going to happen in the future. Yeshua's deliverance from our bondage happened when he died. That's when our sins were transferred onto him. We had deliverance from our sins, but we have had not deliverance from Egypt. So we put these cycles together. Our ultimate deliverance happens at Feast of First Fruits.
Right, because when the Hebrews and the mixed multitude left Egypt, they escaped slavery and they were heading into the promised land.
Exactly.
They didn't end up going straight there because of transgression, but the message was clear. You're leaving slavery, I'm taking you into the promised land.
Right, right. And why didn't they go straight to the promised land?
It's because they were grumbling.
They were grumbling. Their lack of faith. I believe that God's people will be controlled by their faith. Every decision they make will be because of their faith.
Doesn't it say somewhere that if I don't find faith, when I return, I might strike it with curse? What if we ended up getting 40 years of traveling or something?
That's not the way the story ends.
Okay, keep going.
But it's a good question. No, God's people will be ready when he returns because they're going to understand this. But they're going to have to check it out. And that's the thing, is we're going to have to understand these things if we're going to be rescued or delivered on the time.
Okay, let's consider this together. I want to ask you about your oppositions that you get when you're presenting this. So I come from a Baptist background, for example. What do Baptists say in opposition to this?
Well, like we mentioned earlier, is Baptists, generally speaking, they have done away with these things. They have no meaning anymore. You can study them and things like that, but there's no meaning in our life. And I would contradict that by saying...
Did you say no meaning in our life?
No meaning in our life, yes.
There's no meaning in life?
There's no meaning. These have no meaning in our life.
Okay.
Sorry. Thank you. No, thank you for clarifying that. So these don't have any place in our life. But since I've been studying them, which is just about 40 years now, I'm finding that every year they have more meaning in my life.
Well, when you think about it, the Jews didn't make use of this in any final sort of application. It just kind of stopped happening once they lost their sanctuary. And the Christians aren't making use of at least half of this.
Right.
So in that sense, the things that God gave as oracles, which Paul said was a great advantage to us, even after Christ, he said these things are a great advantage to us.
Right.
Here we are. It cannot be possible that they were never useful for anything.
No, he would have given them for a reason. He doesn't do anything just arbitrarily. It was for a purpose.
Yeah,
And
well, my understanding of my church, where I come from, the Baptist church, is they're focused on the grace of God and renewing your sense of faith for the week, and then you come back to church the next week. But I never hear anything about prophecy from that church.
no. And primarily the reason is, the reason why people don't hear anything about prophecy is because so many attempts at prophecy have been made and come and gone and failed, and Jesus or Yeshua is coming at a certain date, it doesn't happen, a time of trouble is going to happen this year, that year, whatever, and it comes and goes. Is people lose sight of the fact that these prophecies themselves, within themselves, say they will not be understood until the time of the end.
Which is exactly how God works, because when he had his first miracle at the marriage where Jesus changed the water into wine, what was the words that came out of the wedding master's mouth? Usually people put out their best first, but you've saved your best for last.
Right, yeah.
Well, I think that the meaning of that miracle was to show the way God works is that in contrast to the way man's religions happen, where you get a charismatic leader which starts a movement, and then after he dies, maybe the next generation keeps it up. But by the third generation, it's usually forgotten about. But he gave these messages thousands of years ago, and it's not until now that you're even hearing tell of somebody connecting the dots between these things. So these books are opening up for understanding. That is not like any human religion that's ever existed.
Right. And it should be noted that doing something like this, and I'm sure there's lots of people, this is the first time they've ever seen this, but it should be noted that this is not anything that I have in myself, that I'm so smart that I figured this thing out. Is the Holy Spirit is the one that helps us understand this stuff. So if it's in his timing that this needs to be understood, he will give the understanding. So.
You know what really gets to me is when people say that prophecy is of no private interpretation. And they say that means that one person can't come up with new information. Right. It has to be in a bunch of people we see at the same time. They all have to come to the same realization at once. Show me an example of that.
Yeah, you won't find one in the Bible.
No, and in fact, in the religion that these people would belong to, you look at who was their leader, who was the beginner of their faith, you know? And where was it scattered across the whole globe when they came up with their ideas? No. In fact, they're talking about not a private interpretation of prophecy. They're talking about, do you know what a private interpretation of prophecy means? What? It means that the interpretation applies to me privately. That in my life, which could be different from yours in your life. Prophecy is about a global thing. It's not different for you than it is for me.
Right.
That's and yeah, so anyways, yeah, keep going.
Okay. So here we have the prophecies, and like I say, I've just hit on some verses here within the prophecies. Now people say, well, Daniel was all fulfilled. Well, we need to read what Yeshua talked about Daniel, and when he points us back to Daniel, we can see clearly that the historical fulfillments have not been fulfilled. So we're looking for a future fulfillment of these prophecies. So that's why we're looking this. You know, a lot of people will take this and turn these into years and so on and do all kinds of gymnastics around it.
Well, what are other oppositions that you get? The gymnastics. Tell us what other ways of looking at this are there?
Well, I came out of the Seventh-day Adventist movement, so to speak, in 1983, going back to the last century. I was introduced to these prophecies, but as I started studying them, I thought, you know, there's more to the story, and I don't want to badmouth them. They did what they could with the information they had, and so on. Truth is ever unfolding, and so we should be moving forward in our understanding of truth. And so I was introduced to the Sabbath and so on. Of course, they don't, as a movement or a church, keep the festivals. And that's something that I learned, that I adopted as I, if you will, advanced in my understanding of God's Word. So that's kind of an opposition from there. The other main opposition, we do a lot of speaking within Messianic groups. And they are convinced for the most part, and some of the main teachers I could name, I'm not going to name them, but if they're watching, I would encourage them, I would challenge them to reconsider some of the things they're teaching. As we mentioned, they are looking at the second coming only through the eyes of the fall feasts, which they're overlooking all of these. And they will never, ever figure out this timetable unless they drop the whole festival calendar on it. And so that's why a lot of them won't even speak on these. They disconnect the two because you can't harmonize them unless you use the whole festival calendar.
So what specifically do the Seventh-day Adventists say?
Well, they have lots of scholars that study the festivals and so on, but they say, well, you don't need to keep them. They're a good point of study, but you don't need to keep them.
About the whole prophecy thing, what's their opposition to what you're saying?
Oh, okay. Their opposition is, like many other evangelical churches, they've taken these prophecies of Daniel and they've applied them back in history. So Alexander the Great, the Medo-Persians, the Greece and Rome and so on, that was all these animal kingdoms. I mentioned Daniel 7. That's with 4 beasts. That's the lion, the bear, leopard, and some dreadful dragon-type beast that comes along. They apply those in history. So Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome, and so on.
But you just told us that Greece doesn't say Greece in the Bible. It actually says Javan.
That's correct. So that's only one piece of the puzzle that gets overlooked, and it's because really it's a mistranslation. It should be.
So what's the main piece of the puzzle that really stops them?
The main one,
that's unique to them and not just like to, you said all the other evangelicals. Because I understand that the Seventh-day Adventists, and I fellowship with lots of Seventh-day Adventists, they're Bible students. They study prophecies. But evangelicals, I don't study with any evangelicals, but I don't think they're much prophecy buffs. I'm more interested in what a Seventh-day Adventist says.
They would consider, what they teach is Yeshua fulfilled these at the cross, which there is no answer for that really, because he did not fulfill any of those at the cross except dying as the Passover. Because, well, if you want to get right into it, is they take the Day of Atonement and they bring that down into a time period in the 1800s and say that was the start of the Day of Atonement. But that in and of itself, it really doesn't hold up when we're looking at the festival calendar, because the Day of Atonement was the Day of Atonement. And that was a 24-hour period back in history. And so if we're going to be consistent, we take Yeshua when he died. He didn't die over a 1-year period or a 10-year period or a 30-year period. He died within a 24-hour period on the Passover. So when we're looking at these fulfillments of the types of these events, the Day of Atonement is called the Day of Atonement for a reason. It's a 24-hour period. And so to stretch the Day of Atonement from 1844 through to the end of time really does the whole calendar a disservice. It doesn't work anymore. And my question is, if you're going to resurrect the Day of Atonement, then why not trumpets? Why not the Feast of Tabernacles? Why just one? You know, it's really, and And here again, I don't want to belittle. They were studying, and they came to a point in their study where they thought they had it all figured out. If they kept advancing, I picked up what they had, and I tried to wrestle with it. I don't fault them, because they did what the best thing they could.
Exactly.
They've been prophesying of the second coming. In fact, the apostles thought he could come within their time period. Well, I don't throw out all the apostles' writings because they thought Yeshua could come back 2,000 years before he was going to. Mm-hmm. You know, that's the reality of it. And it's easy to prove that. That's what they preached. And so just because these people come along and think that he's coming in the 1800s, they were just doing what everyone else did. They were trying to apply the Bible to their day, just like we're trying to do. But Yeshua again said, when you see these things, know. They thought, all previous generations thought they were at the end of time. We need to know, and the reason why we need to know is because we need to prepare for those things. We need to prepare mentally, financially, those things around us that we need to prepare, just like Noah need to prepare. I don't know how much it cost Noah to build his ark. I don't know if he had to take time off work. Did Noah work? But it took him a long time to prepare to save his family. And there's certain things that we need to know what we need to do to prepare. We also, most importantly, need to prepare spiritually. What is it going to mean to see Yeshua and not say, rocks fall on us and hide us from the face of the Lamb? What do we need to? We need to be able to stand and say, "This is our God. We have waited for Him, and He will save us." So there's only going to be two groups of people, and I believe it's the writer of Hebrews says that without holiness, no one will see God. So we want to be able to stand and see Him and live eternally with Him. So there's a spiritual preparation that we need to make in order to survive not only what's coming in the time of trouble, but in order to live through the second coming.
So do you think that someone can take that key that you gave us of overlapping those things and run with it?
I think as they start reading the prophecies, and I'll just give a couple little clues. It says in Revelation chapter 8 that there was a hot coal from the altar, and it was thrown to the earth, and it was the prayers of the saints. If we were to apply that to a festival type, we would be able to look at which I don't have up here, but it plays into the last year, the Feast of Pentecost, when the fire came from heaven and lighted on the apostles for them to do the work of preaching the gospel. And so also in Daniel, like we said before, when we see this judgment take place, that's going to happen at the Feast of Trumpets. That's the beginning of the Feast of Trumpets. In Daniel chapter 7, verse 8 and 9, it says, I saw thrones put in place, the books were opened, judgment was set, and so on. So we can see, as we go through the prophecies, we can start to overlay the festivals in there, and we can see not only the sequence of events, but we can see the timing of those events. And Revelation is the same thing. We see the 7 last plagues being poured out. We see the temple is filled with smoke. The Ark of the Sanctuary, Ark of the Covenant is seen in the sanctuary. We know that only happens on the Day of Atonement. So we can see all of these events play out also. And what does it do? Who cares? So what? What it does for me is it gives me a picture of God that's huge. It's eternal. It's all-knowing. And it shows a loving Father that has given the information to His children so that they can navigate through this time of the end. The prophecies are not scary for me because I know what's coming. Who it should be scary for is people that have no clue what's coming, because it's going to be very serious. And when it hits, it's going to hit with blinding force, and it's going to take us right off our feet if we're not standing on solid ground.
Well, thank you for the lesson. You know what? When your preaching style is more like a professor than, you know, the TV shows you see on Sundays and on television where they have a lot of Bible verses and they're talking about the grace of God in your life and all that stuff. I don't hear you preach like them. You're kind of like a blackboard teacher, a professor.
Well, that's my comfort zone. I guess I don't know if we have
because prophecy is your main thing, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And it is an instructive thing. Really, it is. So.
Mm-hmm. The school of the prophets.
Yeah, there you go.
Who's the prophets?
That would be Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel and so on.
Yeah.
John, the greatest prophet. Good one.
So I guess we have a good ending point there. Do we want to stop here?
I think so.
Okay,
yeah,
let's cut it off.
That's a lot of, yeah. Same thing. Man and God and the Sabbath is what unites them.
Y es lo mismo que significa el hombre y Dios y el sábado en el medio. El sábado es ese pacto matrimonial del hombre con Dios.
All I'm doing here is I'm just pointing you to look at these connections. And when I leave and I'm halfway across the ocean, you're going to be able to start studying this out yourself. So we can't miss these parallels. So we have to study for ourselves. Our first study group, and they just told us what they were interested in, and that's what we did. So, and you got a handful of Daniel and Revelation again, but that is exactly what they were after. They wanted to know what all that stuff meant for us today.